we called this an overview because if we went straight into the depths of medical device development, it could freak a lot of people out, and they might not care to go into this industry. And this is one that I think is one of the most interesting areas that one can work in today. I think it is the industry is at a level of change, not just in this country for a whole bunch of reasons, but around the world. The pressures and the demands on healthcare and the need for it to shift in many, many different ways into essentially to change the paradigm is really, really important. But before I get going, and I don't have this, so this is going to be a degree of storytelling, and at the same time, I think it is intended to skip a stone on things that you need to know as you're contemplating the medical device field. First of all, I just want to get a sense of who's in the room here. How many, have we got undergrads? Not many. Do we have graduates? Do we have entrepreneurs? Come on, we got to have more entrepreneurs than that. Okay, anybody from industry? Oh, I know you. Professors? Good, okay, don't ask me too tricky a question, okay. All right, so any venture capitalists? No, damn. So first of all, you have probably never heard of Zymedica. So I started a company a long time ago out of Rhode Island School of Design. My background is engineering and industrial design. And just to give you a brief history and how we got to where we got, Zymedica was started as a company that develops products. So when I left RISD, I got into the business of essentially selling inventions to companies for royalties. And it was a very fun, very quick turn business that took us into a whole bunch of different areas. We got into sporting goods and toys and infant products and all sorts of mosquito abatement devices. A fascinating career that was always about getting projects and products to market. Over the years, over a span of about 20 years, that business began to erode. And as one gets a little older, and I'm sort of looking at it, and we developed things like, anybody heard of the Easy Button? So I put the Easy Button on the market, and it was great business, but not something I'm particularly proud of. So the company had a mindset of saying, how do we get products, helping our clients get products to market? But at a certain point in one's career, two things were happening. One was the invention market was being eroded because the contract manufacturers were beginning to add services, and so the people that we worked for were essentially bringing the bottom out of that market. And at the same time, I was getting more and more realizing that what we were doing was essentially generating landfill. And at a certain point you go, I just can't do this anymore. So we decided about 7-8 years ago to focus on a field that we as a company could really become interested in. And we focused on the medical field. The two sort of options were military work and medical. And in both cases, we had at that time about 100 designers and engineers and researchers. And we were looking for some type of trade barrier, something that would protect our business, the bottom end of our business, and allow us to grow. And the FDA is an extremely good trade barrier. They essentially, the way that they require our business to perform is makes it very difficult for other people to copy what we do. So the company, and we were probably more interested in saving lives than killing people, so we went for the medical rather than the military. Now in that, we said we wanted to go whole hog. And when I say we're one of the very few companies that's FDA registered, the business that I started with another guy from RISD, and we have designers have very simple sort of concepts in their head. And the concept I had, and we talked about, was, you know, if you're going to be in an industry, if you're going to walk like a duck and you're going to quack like a duck, you've got to be a duck. So you've got to go in and you've got to be registered with the FDA, right? That's the right thing to do. And I went in there and we registered the company with the FDA. I was a brunette when I started it, and I had white hair by the time I finished. Because that was a joke, by the way, so it wasn't actually. But essentially, registering with the FDA, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later, is very strong medicine. It is not something that I necessarily, we hadn't fully evaluated it, but we felt it was the right thing to do, and that has turned out to be correct. So what do? We kept the model that we'd had when we were outside of regulated products, and we work in three main segments in the market. So complex medical devices are typically things that you would find in a hospital. So these are very often capital goods. They are major therapeutics. They're supporting major surgery. They're robotics. They are typically used by professionals. So these are products and devices that are used by folk who've been to medical school and are very highly trained. We work in combination devices, and that is an interesting and emerging field, where essentially there are two or more things coming together. So it is the delivery of drugs or delivery of therapeutics and so forth. And we work in home health, and that is a category which, by our definition, is products that are largely used in the home. And one of the trends right now is that hospitals want to get you out as soon as they possibly can. And you are sent home. I don't know if anybody's had a procedure lately, but you're sent home with a bag of goodies and some instructions that are quite complicated, and you sort of have to administer to yourself. And the level of product that we are now, we're working in the area with people who've had kidney transplants and some really, really complex systems that you now use at home. And these things are the size of dishwashers. They have significant controls on them. And so we sort of categorize that as an area because we saw that developing and designing something that could be used by an 80-year-old diabetic who can't see that well, has neuropathy and a whole series of indications, is a very, very different task to a fit young surgeon who is going to go in and run procedures quickly. And then on the right are the sorts of areas we work in, the things we actually do. and Zymedica was born. We've always had a vertical point of view when it comes to development, and the reason for that is that we wanted to be able to offer our. I'm going to introduce the fellow Zymedicans here. These are some of our cohorts who apparently can't turn up on time, which is a good thing. What we saw when we were working prior to being fully medical was that getting a product to market is not particularly easy. Getting a medical device to market is a hell of a lot harder. And so what we wanted to offer, and our value proposition to our clients, is that we are able to support every part of development. So At the front, you're doing primary research and developing primary technologies and creating the reason for a product to exist. And at the back end, you have a product that is going out for clinical trials. And so our place in time and space is to be able to support our clients conceiving something at the beginning and then being able to get it into a clinical trial and launch. We're not a manufacturer, but we can support early launch. These are some of the sorts of companies that we work for, and these are the big ones. So about half of our business is large, the multinationals, the big multinationals, and we would be working mostly on their non-platform innovations. So things that are leading edge for them, and if you may or may not be familiar with these, but they are broadly covering, this is probably, of the top 30, we probably work with the top 20 of the top 30 medical devices companies. That's about half of our business. The other half are startups, and I always start by saying well-funded startups because there are lots of startups around in the medical device field. If they're not well-funded, then we probably wait until they are. It is the funding models that go along with device development have to be fairly sophisticated. So there's a whole pile of companies that we're working with. Some, I believe, technologies out of Harvard, out of MIT, out of Brown, all over the world that we're helping essentially get to that point that they're going either to be acquired by one of the big OEMs or else they're going to launch as a company themselves. So I want to talk a tiny bit about the industry itself. And again, I don't know how familiar, I don't know how calibrated the audience is, I don't know how familiar you guys are as a group with what's going on. And as always, this is the perspective that I live in. So when there are professors in the room, I know that they know more than I do. So this is really the world that we live in of device development. There are some very major trends in the industry. And at the top of the list is wireless. A couple down, you've got wearables. And the idea of old was that the medical field, I've got to be careful here in case you throw anything at me, but it was a carpentry and plumbing industry. So you'd go in and they're going to chop something and plumb something together and plug things, and it was relatively straightforward. The place we are today is devices that we stick to ourselves that are providing all sorts of therapies and diagnostics, and you imagine, I think right now we're working on 16 different products, individual products that all stick to you and do something in one way or another. And some of them are adhesive, and other ones are bands and so forth. But a whole bunch of different technologies that are riding on your body. In time, I think that as well will evolve. The area of home and personal health is growing, and a huge proportion of both our clients are looking at how the hospitals, everybody wants to reduce costs, so how the hospitals can both have you leave that hospital so they get their payment, and you then go home and you then continue to get better outside of that, outside of the hospital environment is a huge trend. Then you've got all with that the wellness products and monitoring products and so forth. Increasingly, closed-loop devices and I said automated are products that do things without anybody having to input anything to them. So these are glucose monitoring being tied to a diabetic pump, where you're getting a real-time monitoring going on, and the pump is then delivering insulin sort of real time. Whereas if you look right now, anybody with diabetes, it's a very spiky situation where you're taking these readings from time to time and you're injecting yourself. One of the areas that this is going to go is something where you're reacting directly to what your body, and increasingly predictively to what your body is going to need. So if the pump knows that you're going to have lunch, you have lunch every day about 12 o'clock because it's seen that pattern, then it can predictively give you a therapy. And then things like big data. So big data is, we see across the board, is uploading information that then can be looked at and downloaded in a way that is actionable for any number of therapies. So essentially, the number crunching going on to create bigger patterns and bigger trends, and we're working with companies up and down this country on all sorts of ways of profiling patients, segmenting them better, delivering more incisive therapies based on multiple inputs. So big data is huge. The other side of that is what are drivers going on in the industry. So an awful lot of the ability to converge technologies. So bringing a series of technologies together. Not everything has to be a bespoke invention. A lot of times just putting a series of things together in a useful way can of itself become an innovation. The patient today is part of the solution of health. And when a patient goes into a doctor's office, for better or worse, they've looked up WebMD and they have already got an idea of what they think they have, and they've self-diagnosed, and it must frustrate the heck out of all sorts of docs that they're sort of coming in ready armed with the solution. And so, there is a bad side to that, but there's also a good side to that, in that for many indications, you want the engagement of the patient. You want them to be involved, particularly in chronic situations with you want them to be part of the solution. But they are now going to be informed, and for the better or worse, I think it's probably a better thing. The industry, as you know, in this country, I mean, you guys know the stats, we are 37th least healthy, no, 37th most healthy, so we're not that healthy. And we managed to do that at double the cost. So the reason that we are working now with everybody from computer companies, telecom companies, everybody knows that there is money on the table in the USA's health system. And that could be born out of sheer inefficiencies in the system. It is we spend an awful lot of time in hospitals. So in the research work that we do, hospitals have put themselves together in a way that around any other industry has optimized itself. I think there are 7,500 hospitals in the USA. We walk into hospitals that are all part of the same group, and it's walking into a different system. And there is the beginnings of really trying to understand how to bring those together. But this is, when inefficiency sounds like a bad word, it's not. It is simply how the system has put itself together with loads and loads of different layers. With every layer, there is a need there is some profit in that layer. You add all those up, and all of a sudden, you've got a lot of costs and not a particularly great solution. At the same time, we have incredible technologies. We have the people who are so interested and focused on trying to deliver the best. But I can tell you that and anybody who works a lot in that environment, is we don't make life very easy for our doctors and our nurses. We don't make it easy for the technicians. to do their job as well as we can. And there are huge opportunities to both be more efficient, to make doctors and nurses more satisfied and more able to focus on the patient, and to save money all at the same time. So this is a big frontier discovery work is what I imagine that you do in your labs here, which is going out and finding therapies at the leading edge of technology and things that are way far out of my realm. We are an implementer. We have absolutely. We wait until you've got something really good in a petri dish, and then we come in. We're not a core research company. We're really waiting for that technology to appear. And then the last one here, and there's a bunch more, but these are big ones, is compliance. One of the biggest problems in the medical field is that only a third of all, as an example, only a third of all prescriptions get picked up, which you'd think that health and death would be a pretty good motivator. It proves not to be a good motivator at all. No, big one. A third of prescriptions do not get picked up. So 2/3 do get picked up. The second third, and we do a great deal of work with a company in the pharmacy company. The focus on compliance and ways of changing behavior for people to become compliant with their medication is good for patients. It's good for the folk who make the therapies, and yet it is more elusive than one thinks it should be. So compliance is on a lot of companies' minds. So switching a little bit. Any questions or thoughts with that? So we try to put together a model that essentially looks at where the drivers are within the field, and projects come, and I just sort of pick a few. I don't have a gobload of slides here, so this is sort of I'm going to talk more, and there's not many notes you have to take, which sort of saves you, right? So you can. This is about just stories. So there's really three things that we look at and we typically see with any particular medical device is there's a human need. So what do people want? And the folk we work with, oftentimes patients, very often caregivers, increasingly more often than not caregivers, particularly in those sort of home environments. Within the hospitals, the docs, the nurses, the technicians, the purchasing people, and so forth. So the baseline, and this comes right out of the FDA. The baseline from the FDA's waterfall chart is you've got to find out who your user is and what your user needs are, and that is the first box on the FDA's process. These are things that are going on in the industry. So I put in emerging markets, and I'll give you an example recently is, and not that China's an emerging market, but has emerging market issues in many places, is we have been doing some work in the area of robotics. And they were looking, we had a group came in from China who was very interested in a particular robotic device that we were looking at. And to our delight to a degree and somewhat surprise, they more or less ordered the product right off the bat. They'll say, yeah, we need these things. And we said, well, it hasn't entirely been finished. And it was basically a rapid triage device. And it allowed somebody to go up and through a series, stand at a console, and through a series of fairly rudimentary tests, they could get about 60% of the way through a diagnostic. And we were like, well, it would come to a certain level of triage as to you should go this way, that way, or the other way. And so in probing into what was interesting to them in that, the driver in that case was that we don't have enough docs to put on the front line. So we need to be able to essentially have something that is at an early stage saying, yes, needs to go this way, so they could use their doctors more efficiently. We have segmentation in the idea of demographics. Before the patient came into the space as part of the solution, you could more or less hand out something and say you need to use this. Today, all the big drug companies are looking at their market segments. They're looking at their patient populations, and they are driving both their therapies and their products towards segments within the market. So if we're designing something for women from the age of 16 to 22, that is a very particular segment. It's big enough, but it drives the way that something is developed. It drives the way if you're creating user inputs and screens and so forth. The segmentation is now a big part of how people are thinking about their audiences. Compliance we've talked about. Robotics is I think really interesting in that there's a lot of robotics right now which I would call master-slave relationships. So it is somebody doing something and there is a machine that is then executing on that. The following waves will have more intelligence coming in, I think, on the way, and we're beginning to see products where they're getting closer to an automated or a system that is making its own decisions as part of that. Sensors for everything. Everybody from the military, I don't know if we got Fitbit users and Nike Fuel users, but sensors are coming onto the body. We have they're watching you. So we have programs where I've always got to be a little bit careful I don't go too far in what I say. But essentially, the ability to look at somebody and their behavior so that a medical situation can be understood, resolved, etc. Again, working with a big foreign Asian insurance company who is looking for a virtuous cycle with their patient. They are, I think, very conscious that and aware that a healthy patient allows them, a healthy customer allows them to keep costs down, and so the idea of virtuous cycles where a customer is inputting certain data about things that they are doing. The insurance company is receiving that data, probably doing things that maybe in this country you can or cannot do, which is then creating reward systems for health, although there's some of that being tried in different ways. But doing all of that observationally through things that you can derive from 6 feet away. So without you knowing, there is something in your house that is watching you, and it could be looking if you're elderly, the idea of devices that go on your body, and if you fall over, and to go a little deeper now in some specifics. So I think I have 3 or 4 case studies. This I'm admittedly I'm sort of picking these to with an entrepreneurial mind. So this product, Zeo, came to us, a bunch of guys out of Brown University, out of their sleep lab, and they came to us with some computers and the laptops and some sensors. And they had algorithms that they could show that if you were woken up in the right stage of sleep in the morning, you could get up and you could be in a pretty darn good mood, and you felt fresh, and you were sort of ready to get on with the day. Some of you may have experienced this, that at other times you get woken up by your alarm clock, you're like, oh, it just starts badly. And they had the data behind that, and so we worked with them to bring this product. We worked with them to bring this product to market. So all the industrial design, the physical engineering, we set up a factory for them in China, and we had a very, very close relationship on a product that was really at a leading edge of sleep. It was bringing early sleep technologies, and this is some years ago, to market. At the same time, this industry is moving fast. It was eclipsed by, there were two things, and I know a little bit about it. Nobody from Zeo here, right? No, good. I know a little bit about it. There were two things that they did that happened. One was they chose not to go the regulated path. So they chose not to say that create any claims on the product. And I don't know if you know about claims, but claims are a sort of one of the things that the FDA looks at to say you're under our jurisdiction or you're not. And it's a dance, and we'll talk a little bit about the regulatory path in a bit. But they said, we're going to go fast to market, and we're going. It essentially went onto the market as a very high-priced alarm clock, but it made you got up sort of feeling pretty frisky, and that's good. The fact it's hard to be high-priced in a fast-moving market if you can't substantiate claims. So claims, as you think of the sort of product or service that you'd want to bring to market as an entrepreneur, how you deal with claims is really, really important, because if you can stand by them, your ability to defend your position, to charge more, etc., or even get a code for reimbursement and so forth goes up massively. The other thing that happened was apps came along, and what you essentially can now plug in to any smartphone and have something that you didn't need all the product for. So again, this is a fast industry. It was a great product at the time, and the industry exists, but they probably took on a wee bit too much debt and didn't make it.
About the case study that you were mentioning, what claims could have they done that they didn't? That could have.
Well, theoretically, they could have made the claim that you wake up in a refreshed state, and that was beneficial to your health. So there were things that they believed that related to health. So there were a series of things about being more alert, etc. They had a laundry list of things that they toyed with, but you'd have to do a clinical trial in order to you've got to show something to say, yeah, this is true. There is a benefit here.
So it's a trade-off of marketing versus regulatory, right? You cannot.
It's really a trade-off of time. It's a trade-off of time and money, right. in a way, and because to do a clinical trial to demonstrate efficacy takes some time. It's going to cost some money, but then you can say things, and if you look at any number of products, there are a lot of products that say something, but you surmise what it's going to do all by yourself. And so they were sort of on that edge, and it was a decision. They made a decision. We're going to go fast to market and not go with the claims. Whereas arguably, going with the claims would have given them a better defense of their platform. And many of these sort of home, quasi-home health products, they're living. I was just at speaking at the CES, the Consumer Electronics Show, and there are a mass of companies who are standing on the edge of saying, are we going to jump into this medical field, or are we just going to allow the customer to derive what they would like to derive from the information we give them? So, what you do when you've taken a bunch of readings on your phone, and you say, well, I'm going to do something about that. They haven't delivered. They've given you some information, but you haven't got a diagnostic. It hasn't said the following things are going to happen, which they can do. And so it's a real. It is part of the planning process in any of these products. This is really an efficacy story where a product. It's a drug delivery device, the idea being that if you can deliver a drug deep up into your nasal cavity, and this company has a very clever way of pushing drug right up into your nasal cavity so that it's very close to your brain, then they can deliver more, they can deliver a better therapy with significantly less of a very expensive drug. So all this is really is almost a human factors exercise. This is saying, how do we do that most efficiently? The benefits to the patient are obvious. You're putting the drug where you're using it, where you're delivering it where you use it. You're using less of that drug, so you're driving compliance, you're lowering costs, you're getting the patient better. And this is a sort of classic win-win drug delivery device. They didn't invent the drug. They are simply improving the delivery of that drug, and that is just it's as a lot of drugs are coming off patent. There is a whole bunch of companies looking at how drugs can be better deployed. So this is this combination device market. For the engineers in the room, here is a very, very simple product. It delivers warm, wet, oxygenated air to very young, very small babies. And from an engineering perspective, this is really this is a mechanical solution to a known problem that there are reimbursement codes that go with it. The benefits were developed long before these guys came along, but they just came up with, and we engineered and built the product for them, a device there was already a track record. So in terms of the regulatory requirements were relatively straightforward, in that it's a straight sort of 510K. But it's a mechanical solution to a known therapy, and a relatively straightforward. This is cool. It is a little thing. We call them smart bandages. As you can tell, I'm not the technical guy in here, so I worried there's a bunch of docs who are going, this guy doesn't know anything about medical stuff, which I don't. But I know about these things. We don't pretend at Zymedica. We don't pretend in areas that we're not strong. Well, we rely on having friends who know exactly what they're talking about. What this thing does is it delivers a signal to specific sets of nerves in the body, such that one can turn, in this case, you can turn your bladder on and off through your smartphone. And and the humor that we've had with this, you can only imagine. But what you would do with it at the pub and so forth. But it is, this is where we worked with some core scientists. Again, they had all of all the algorithms. They had tuned the waves such that what we did was a packaging job to put this on the market, to take it through all of the usability, to take it through all the tests to ensure that if you're wearing it for a week, it didn't cause a rash, to make sure that the software couldn't go awry and you suddenly started doing things you didn't want to do where you didn't want to do them. So that there are components of developing products where there is a whole validation phase that is really important. So you can imagine that the idea now that you can control muscle groups with a little band, with a thing this big, and get it to do things that you want it to do, has enormous possibilities. And so this would fall under wearables and wearable therapies and so forth. And there's just a myriad of great stuff going on there. This is a product that delivers. It looks at the resiliency of certain natural orifice sphincters. So in this case, GERD. What? That was a funny word? No, we laugh a lot, don't worry. So in this case, it's looking at it's delivering to the doc a bunch of feedback that he or she can then relate to the improvement or lack thereof on certain therapies that a patient is being given. So this is a part of the connectivity with a relatively straightforward device connecting all the way through to the dock and back, such that there is the ability to tune therapies essentially while you're at home. And again, this idea that you've connected yourself up to the dock and back is part of many of the new products coming to the market. This is the only lesson I have here. So I thought that you should have a lesson, right, at college. What's that? Oh.
Yeah, sorry, one question. So I'm wondering, how does the sales and marketing of this device different from, say, the traditional consumer electronic devices?
The path to market in the medical field is completely different. The way that a devices are paid for is they are either you've essentially got a series of different payers in the market. So the insurance companies, and this is you've asked a question that we could have an entire session on this, because the way there are groups in New York, I beg your pardon, in Washington, who set is a very strange business. If you worked in the consumer field, you go, well, we want to get it to a point that we can make make the biggest margin we possibly can. That doesn't work the same way, certainly in the U.S. system, and it is while it's not my full area of knowledge, I'll give you the bit that I know. It is the price of therapies generally gets set, and by groups that I think of hospitals and doctors and insurance companies, and then you design to that price. So we know oftentimes when we're working on a product what the number that we've got to hit, and if we can or the price that is available for that. But this is a whole area where there's this whole thing right now is nobody really knows the price of medicine. And in this country, and different hospitals charge you different amounts for the same therapies and so forth. It is a very, very convoluted area. Then there is medicine that you pay for. There are things you pay for yourself. There are things you buy over the counter. There are things the insurance companies pay for. There are all sorts of offsets and trading within that. But what I'll say to you is that part of and this will come up in a second, but part of the challenge of understanding where your device or therapy is going to fit in is understanding if it's going to live under an existing code, or if you're going to have to develop a new code, in which case you've got to show that you've got to demonstrate the efficacy of this. This is not my area, but it's something that is a significant part of developing, because it can really work for you. In other words, if you can come in at a significant cost less and the price stays the same, then that can be a very good thing. So you can create inordinate margins. At the same time, the general mode right now is to push those margins and those prices down. So that was half an answer because I'm half knowledgeable about it. Going in, the first thing, and the lesson that you have to have the mind shift on in this industry is it's a regulated industry, and it isn't. Everybody thinks of the FDA, but there are a dozen other regulatory bodies that you have to deal with on the way. In itself, that isn't a problem. The bulk of those regulations are in place to protect the patient population, to protect if you're working with, a lot of work we do is with the elderly. We have to go out and we have to study elderly people. People over, I think, 65 years old are a protected population, and so the way you collect information, the way you use information. There's patient privacy. There's a whole bunch of different regulations in place through the process, and you have to prepare yourself for that. So it just and this goes for there's no outside of the U.S. in the EU. There is the same thing. If we're working with China, there's the SFDA. They're doing the same thing. This is the part of this industry. And if ever, you may have done it, if ever you sort of read or credential yourself, so if you're working in hospitals, now 10 years ago we could walk into a hospital and we could do all sorts of fun stuff and observations and hand things to people and take photographs and try stuff and so forth. You can't do that anymore. All of our entire research team has to be credentialed. And the reason for that is that these are very sensitive environments. The government's concerned about it, hospitals are concerned about it. So they want to know that there is a certain standard of both, I'll call it a sort of moral standard, in terms of how, an ethical standard in how you're going to behave in a hospital, and that you know the environment, and there's a degree of training that goes with that. And that you have to take bloodborne pathogen training and so forth if you're going to work in these environments. So it's regulated, and that just needs to be something that's in your mind. The biggest component of that regulation, the one everybody knows, the FDA. And I think that the thing here, if you guys know this, then that's great. But what the FDA does is their primary focus is on the safety and efficacy of your device. So they want to know, one, that it is safe to use, and two, that it does what it's supposed to do. And but with and beyond that, they care about that it was developed safely, that the trials you did on it were safe. That at no part through the process of the development of that product did you endanger the users, the patients, the docs, and so forth. So it's a very it's important to know that their view is very clear, and the large, older corporations, the FDA has changed and upgraded its view of the stick that it wields significantly. Over the years that I've been doing this, 10, 15 years, every half year there is an upgrade in what the FDA asks you to do. When you learn about it, it's not a bad thing, it's not challenging, and you typically understand why they've done it. And usually there is some hideous case of something that went wrong when the FDA, when something, I'll say, untoward happened to somebody as part of the development of a product. The second thing to remember is that the FDA does not care about your business. That is not their point of view, and or that's not their jurisdiction. So the amount of money that you put into developing a product or a service, and the amount of money that you take out of it, that's not of interest to them. There are a whole bunch of things that your product is going to have to do outside of the view of the FDA. And so I say this because at the end of the day, as somebody working in this field and with the tremendous opportunities that exist within it, you have just satisfying the FDA does not of itself create a successful product, and just satisfying your business model does not bother the FDA in the slightest. You're still going to have to jump through their hoops. So, and this is where, with things like mobile apps, you're probably aware that there's some significant dialogue going on as to where is the jurisdiction of the FDA. And the fact is that technology and the opportunities of today are moving faster than a very well-meaning but slightly slower-moving governmental body who's is going to continue to look at the ensuring that the population is safe, there's a lot of tension there, and I think they're doing the best they can. At the same time, the more that in our industry, in our sort of view of the world, the more that the techies are coming in who are used to writing code and changing a product overnight, and the FDA are meeting, there's probably more tension. But it is, we're inventing faster than them, that they can define their rules to support it.
So, is it on? Yeah, regarding the efficacy of the product, if my company is launching a product which is 90% effective compared to a solution already existing in the market, but it is priced much lower, will FDA allow, because it's not as effective as a predicate, but I'm going to it's going to be priced, let's say 25% of the existing solution.
I think I need a bit more information. So there are gold standards. To answer generally, there are gold standards in the industry that when you develop something, the tendency is to say, okay, this is the gold standard. Have you met that? Have you met the sensitivity and the specificity of that gold standard? So are you as good? Now, that is a very gross generalization. So I'd need to know much more about the particulars, and this is where things like segmentation come in, because you don't have to. One of the things beginning to happen is they're saying, well, 90% is great for 90% of the population. There's another 10% it's not any good at all for, and this is where the segmentation of patient populations and defining. A lot of drugs when they first came out, they didn't work the same for everybody, And so the drug companies are getting much better at saying, we work really well for this group, but we recognize that we don't, for a different group, we may need to tune that, or we may need a second therapy, and so forth. So it's very situational. The cost structure, that's your business. So this is where they're really not interested. They're going to look at the specific of that patient population and what you're trying to do, and so forth.
Yeah, so my question was more motivated from the point that if we look at theory of disruption or disruptive innovation, the way Clayton Christensen talks about it, I don't think that happens in US healthcare, and that's part of the problem. We don't get products which eventually over the long run will get better but be significantly cheaper. Because my limited understanding, and I'm not very knowledgeable about this, is you're always compared to the solution existing in the market, and you have to at least meet or exceed those standards. And that totally goes against the fundamental idea of how disruption happens in a lot of industries, where you come up with an inferior product, slightly inferior product, which is significantly cheaper, and over time you improve the performance, like Clayton's work on disk drives and all that. I mean, I'm not sure whether it can happen in medical devices in US.
Well, let me help you there, because it really doesn't quite work that way. If you set up, if you approach FDA with data that you're 90% as good as whatever you compare to, you will never get an approval. However, you get to choose your comparator. If you go in and you say, we may not be as good as the current gold standard, but we're better than placebo, however you define an inert treatment, you will get approval based on being better than placebo. And then the regulatory process, depending on which country you're in, will work out a pricing structure for that. So you're completely open to these disruptive technologies. You have a really cheap way to take care of Alzheimer's patients. The world is going to be the path to your door. And all you have to do is prove you're better than something. And that's all it takes. But that's
The pricing that comes in may reflect what your standard is. So, I was thinking about, I think there is a massive amount of, I think there is going to be more disruptive innovation right now and for the next 10 years than there ever has been. And if I was one of the big old platform companies, I would be very concerned about the disruptive. We work, there's only one human body. We're working on a whole bunch of ways to deal with one particular problem. So, I mean, there was a time of a couple of years ago when we were working on 5 different ways of mitigating stress incontinence. Some of them were technical, some of them were product-based. We would do all these different products, all for different companies, and we'd firewall them from each other, all at the same time. The nervous companies are the ones who are holding on to huge capital bases where they've got these platforms, and they know that they have to disrupt themselves. They have to let some of their old platforms go. So yeah, I wouldn't be worried about the level of disruptive innovation that certainly that we see coming over the bow is more interesting, it's more exciting, it's a lot more disruptive than it's ever been.
So I guess I'm a little bit confused. So you said that as long as you can prove your product is better than placebo, then you can be FDA approved. But I thought that a lot of problems with, or IRB has problems with conducting clinical trials where you don't offer the standard of care when it's in existence. So I don't know how to, I guess, reconcile that fact.
Let's say with epilepsy, where placebo controls are not. So the path for treatments, let's say for a disease like epilepsy, where placebo controls are not considered ethical, right? Instead of doing a one treatment versus placebo study, the typical approach is to do an adjunct to an existing therapy versus adding placebo to that same existing therapy. Okay, if everybody got a standard anticonvulsant plus your treatment, or plus the standard anticonvulsant plus a placebo, that kind of approach is perfectly good with FDA. But you do need to prove something in a well-designed, adequately powered, adequately controlled experiment.
And in our experience, because we've had a number of IRBs have been turned down because they didn't think that something was enough. So you have there's an evaluation of risk versus reward, and then there's cost in there as well. So it's like, how much is something? The cost falls out at a different point, because if it's only doing X amount more, then it's not worth as much. And so this is where so I'm going to get to 7 elements for success, because this is very much a part of what you need to look at. So what we get asked to assess a lot of technologies, and what I put down here were 7 areas that typically, if you're going out for funding, if you're writing an SBIR, if you're talking to a venture capitalist, they're going to ask you a bunch of questions, and you've got to have these 7 boxes typically are going to help you in those conversations. And so I put these in as extremely high level, but one way or another, you need to know what your market is. You need to know the value that you're going to bring to that market. So in the case of one of the areas when we're in hospitals, for instance, we've been working on a lot of what are called rapid diagnostics. So things that can create a diagnostic in a hospital faster, ideally a sort of point of care, so right in the moment. And the metric for that, and the metric for an awful lot of what goes on in a hospital, is time. And so if you can monetize time, you can then say to you can demonstrate the value of a particular device by saying we are saving X amount of time in that diagnosis. Therefore, you can move somebody through the hospital more quickly, and you can get your patient, the next patient more quicker, et cetera, et cetera. So understanding where the value is, and today, as the industry has shifted, we spend a lot more time going out and drilling down on behalf of our clients, if they haven't already done so, into where the value points of a particular service or therapy are, so that it can justify its costs. Now, in the same time, knowing the markets, knowing the competitors, having a lay of the land and so forth is all part of having a significant knowledge of the marketplace, but also of understanding your value proposition within that. And in things like how you're going to get paid, this is where part of the business case is going to build up. The IP landscape, when we were in general product development, we'd get products to market without even thinking about IP. If you got sued after a year and a half, oftentimes you were already out of the business, and you'd move on to the next thing. And it was fast moving, and sometimes you had to pay somebody 5%, but you really didn't have to think about it that much, because the consumer world, is just very, very quick. In the medical industry, putting a product on the market is expensive, and so anybody, they're going to ask you about your position of your IP. If they're going to invest $5, $10, $20 million into a particular concept, then you've got to have an IP strategy. And IP, because you're students, I'll say, a lot of times everybody thinks about IP as being protection. IP, one of the most interesting things, I spend a lot of time, and I'm sort of, I have a half hobby reading patents. IP is intended for you to learn. And it is, in that most of it is lasting 21 years or so, or 22, whatever it is these days. It is a great area to look at and learn from. And I think at a certain level, to be familiar enough with how to go about patent searches and how to read patents and how to glean and use that existing knowledge is really important. So in most projects, there are two components. One is making sure that you're not going to run into a piece of IP that's going to derail you. And then the other is to make sure that you are suitably protected. And it is, we were working on something a while ago where I think there was something like 1,000 patents that we had to go through. And what you find is that you're going to use, some of them are out of date, and you're going to use them to build your new platform on. And so if it's public domain, you can use it, and then you're going to build off that. So it is, there are few things these days, and you guys, and certainly maybe working at the forefront of certain technologies, but an awful lot of times, there are great businesses to be had. We're working with a company right now that has focused on pediatric laparoscopic tools. Brilliant. One of the cleverest things I've seen is they just make it smaller. And all the IP is already there. It's already public domain. They take it out, they make it smaller, they stick it into babies. And I'm just like, that is a brilliant, I wish I'd thought of that. That is just a brilliant use of intellectual property in a way that brings huge benefit, and they don't have to defend anything. So IP is something that is just a great thing to think of. Are you not giving me the eye, are you?
No.
Are you? Okay, well, you just give me that.
Question, when they shrink it, they can file IP on that, can they
No.
not?
No. No, smaller is just smaller. It's smaller is not novel, typically. I mean, like everything I say is a generalization. But no, not typically. Well, if it's miniature, maybe. In this case, no, there was nothing. And just I just thought it was so poetic. We've talked a little bit about the regulatory path, and again, I want to be clear. This is we have people at Zymedica who, incidentally, are available to any of you. We do office hours up here, like once a month or something. And if anybody wants to talk about, is interested in regulatory, we've got some really phenomenal people who've been in the industry a long time. But particularly in areas where that home health, wellness products and so forth, understanding your regulatory path. If you're going into the surgical suite, well, you are more than likely going to be one level of class device, and there's nothing much clever that you can do. But there's a whole mass of products today that are living in a gray zone where you can make decisions that might allow you to move more quickly. They might allow you more protection or less protection, and sometimes a lot of value going to the market quickly, and you can backfill a regulatory. So you can go in and make claims later on. So you can launch in one way and then add claims later. But the real point is here is part of any device that you're going to bring to the market. You have to understand. You have to have strategized on how you're going to maneuver through that, create a regulatory strategy. And the FDA is happy to be part of that. So this isn't you doing it alone. We have multiple meetings where we go out and we'll very early on, we'll have a chat, we'll say, this is sort of kind of what we're thinking, what do you think? and creating a relationship with the FDA early on so that you're making the right decisions. So design, are we mostly engineers here, or mostly engineers? So the understanding that the technology is just a component and of what a product has to do. The product that we've shown here is the bulk of the design work was not relating to what the therapy was. It was relating to making it the most simple, usable device that it could possibly be. And so typically when one thinks of the design of a product, you're thinking of the industrial design and the engineering and the user interfaces and so forth. The way the flow works from the FDA, and this is on their website, and it's sort of worth familiarizing yourself with. I'm sure you already have, but if you haven't, is that they start with the user, and the process is very clear that it is essentially what is the user. They call it the user needs, user requirements, and that flows down into a specification, and that in turn flows into the design and engineering of the product. And then you have V&V. Do you guys know what V&V is? So V&V is the one that really gets you. It's verification and validation, and it's a really important concept in that what they do, because if I've done those three things, typically I know what the user is, I've specified what I want, and I've engineered it, I'm going to market in any other field, but not in the medical field. They ask you to do two things. Verification and validation. And verification is that you have gone back into that product and you have checked that you have designed to the specifications that you laid out. So if you said this is going to, I need this switch to be triggered in this way, then the verification is demonstrating that you have done that. And then the second is validation. And validation is going further and now making sure that that device does what you said it's going to do. And that is so they check that it is what you said it's going to be. And then before they let you take it out into a trial and make sure that it does what you said it's going to do. So understanding that as part of the process is what makes this field take longer and cost more. And I said manufacture and launch is often the process that the most burdensome, expensive, and frustration. And again, I say that because we work with so many startups, and they think they've got to the finish line. And part of that V&V process are a whole series of steps that from an engineering perspective, you think we're done. But there is not just there is validation of your supply chain to make sure that you have a supply chain that's safe. There is process validation, that the way that you put something together, that has been qualified. So a whole series of components that are essentially supporting that product being built right, designed right, built right, used right. Usability is a huge part of this as well. Have you designed something that people can use? I've got 2 more slides, so we're okay. Planning. The way that you get through what might appear right now to be a whole bunch of burdens to what you really want to do, which is crack through the design and get it out on the market as fast as you can, is to have a really, really robust plan. And the plan essentially is how you capture all of those components of going out into the market, doing the research, building the regulatory path which comes in. Human factors today is a whole, has come to the forefront as an area that essentially now is part of the entire development process. using the industrial designers, engineers, software, and all of these. And you have to have a really robust plan. Because and we see this endlessly, is that plans that are half complete, half funded, they haven't understood all the steps that are going to take place. Essentially, companies that get 90% of the way down the road have run out of money, run out of time, and run out of steam because they didn't know all the things that they were going to have to do. And again, if you know what they are, they're not that. I'm sort of conscious of not trying to turn you off because I think it's such a fascinating field, but at the same time, sort of know what you're getting yourself into. So the robust planning says who you're going to need on this on a program, and essentially what it's going to cost. And so it really drives the last thing, which is the conversation about funding. And whatever you're doing, we see that the big corporations, if they're good, are typically funding all the way through. So they know that there's a piece of road that they are still going to have milestones, and those milestones are going to typically relate to their own checks that this is going the way they need it to go. But their view, if they're good, is usually that they are going to the end. So that's the big corporations. VC-funded projects are typically looking for value jumps. And we had a product we were working on a few months ago, and we did a very small bit of work to essentially demonstrate that this thing was feasible, it could work, it could be made, it had a market, and he flipped the thing, and I suspect, I'd like to say he retired, but he's not the sort of person who's going to retire. He'll be at it again. And he just flipped it like that because he got such a pop in showing that this thing, nothing was ever put together, but it could be made, it had value, it had a very clear value proposition, it had a code attached to it, that he was able to turn it on over to a larger company right away. So understanding where value is created in medical devices, fewer and fewer of our customers come to us today and say, oh, we're a startup, but we're going all the way to the finish line. Almost all of them are getting off and finding a big strategic partner to support them. And the big OEMs are more than happy to let you do that high risk, heavy lifting early on, because they've then got the machine. They're huge marketing machines. They've got the pipeline. They know the industry really, really well. And so almost all of them, if they haven't already got a partner, then they've got targets who that they know that they're going to be linking up with at some point. And I think that allows the serial entrepreneur to come back into the market multiple times with new concepts, and so really understanding where you're going to, what your exit ramp is, and that there are great opportunities within the development field to not go to the finish line. When somebody out of Harvard or MIT said, I'm going to start a company and I'm going into medical and that's all I'm going to do, I'm like, if you're really smart, then take it so far and get off the bus just at the right time and go and do it again, and you'll live a much more happier, more interesting life.
So Aidan, to just carry on that note, what is the appropriate time to start engaging in a potential strategic partner?
I don't think, because I'm running through like a bunch of different scenarios, and it amazes me, it doesn't amaze me, that the strategics can come in very, very, very early. And every major corporation, the J&Js and Boston Scientific, everybody right now, they all have a venture arm. And I think most of our startups that we're working with have all been funded by the venture arms at some level of a Medtronic or something. These guys are big VCs, and I would certainly, when you think of the VC market, if you know that you're largely going to be in an area that an Ethicon would be interested in, then you can have that conversation really, really early. And we're working directly in some cases, for the venture arm. In many cases, there are VCs in there. We've gone past the friends and family are in there. The VCs are in there. The angels are in there, and the big guys are in there as well. So I never think it's if you're going to start dating, you might as well start today, and you're able to that's good advice, right? You wrote it down. That's one of these things you just listen to. I think that idea that by starting the conversation, you are able to begin to understand what they're looking for as well, because almost never does what you start turn into what you finish with. It always evolves. And even like technologies, we've seen technologies take left turns. They're brilliant, but there was no market, so there's a left turn, and they find somewhere that there is a market for them. And you see that with all sorts of particularly technology-driven things are often solutions looking for a problem, and having a good look for that problem is key. I think I probably talked enough. Did I?
Hi. Question related to the medical device startup landscape. With many startups right now related to FDA registered or not registered, like Fitbit or Jawbone, are you seeing the trend that startups remain fragmented or even more fragmented, or actually you're seeing a trend that big firm like Medtronic or Boston Scientific start acquiring the startups in the future?
Well, the big companies are certainly acquiring startups, no question. We're familiar. We work with Fitbit, with Body Media, and we work with now Jawbone. I think that the challenge for them, and it was very interesting at CES. The CES had a whole bunch of medical folk and a whole bunch of what I would call classic consumer electronics folk. And the medical guys were saying, come on, you need to enter this market if you're going to play with it. Giving people certain levels of information is only so useful. And the docs are really looking for that technology, of some of which is very sophisticated, to make that sort of further leap to become a genuine therapy or a genuine diagnostic, and to really help them out. And so it's a slightly strange skits in the market where the nervousness, I'm talking to a very big consumer electronics company right now, and they just don't know if the things that we talked about in terms of regulatory it's like it's not their business. They move very quickly. The DNA is different, and so sort of aligning them with the DNA, aligning their DNA with the DNA of a regulated company is just something that some of them, I'm surprised that they've moved so slowly.
So you mentioned FDA registration is very important for big companies, but what about for independent projects? How do smaller groups get a relationship with the FDA?
My self-serving answer is please don't. One of the reason that Zymedica, as one of the very, very, very few companies in this country that's registered, is its development company that's registered with the FDA, is that we are now, companies use our FDA registration to allow them to get to the market. The last thing you want to build is a quality management system. You don't want to get audited. You don't want to have to go out and audit all your suppliers. There's a whole lot of stuff that you just don't want to do. And my sort of advice to you would be go work with somebody who can who has all that in place, and there are other folk who do it as well, but not a hell of a lot. Where you focus on the technology and use somebody else's system. And I mean, right now we're working on 40, 50 products at any one time, and we are probably more audited than most of. Well, that's not true. We get audited by absolutely everybody. It's sort of a proctology a day, you know. So I would caution against. Again, we had a individual, I think might have been out of Weiss, who recently came that we've done some stuff with, and he was hell bent on I'm going to build it. I'm going to build a machine, and I'm like, oh, please don't. It distracts you. Let entrepreneurs and inventors and core scientists, let them do that and focus on that and find folk to work with. This is not a go it alone industry, in my opinion, and admittedly that's entirely self-serving. But
Well, I think that's actually a good segue to the fact that Aiden does office hours here at the iLab once a month. So if you're a student here or a postdoc, you can sign up. It's on our website. And I think as students, that being an entrepreneur, the great thing is that it's a very safe space and you have a lot of access to a lot of folks at the university. So take advantage of that while you're a student. Once you graduate, we're trying to figure out how we're going to work with alumni, but at this point, do it when you're a student. I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank Aiden for spending some time with us tonight and giving us a very high-level discussion. And